Hey all, Braden here. Today I want to take a little bit to talk about the Magic the Gathering Commander bans. I know there have been infinity bajillion videos on the subject from a lot of very respected Magic content creators. I highly recommend taking some time to peruse a number of those. I've been taking time myself to kind of ruminate over the various opinions and weigh them against my initial reaction to the announcement that happened on Monday. I'm recording this the Sunday after the announcement. And I have some thoughts. I've been asked about my opinion on these quite a few times locally, actually. Since I'm a content creator in the space, even though I don't make a ton of Magic content, I'm very much a Magic enthusiast. I make sure to hit a Magic convention or two every year at this point. I am very active in our local Commander group, and I'm constantly working on tweaking or brewing something new for my various deck lists. So this is clearly not a scripted video. I'm going to try and stay on task as much as possible, but if I ramble a little bit, I do apologize up front. Normally I would have an outline I'd go through, but I figured it might be better just to be a little more freeform on this because my overarching opinions have not dramatically changed since the announcement, and I have a number of thoughts that I want to get down in video form so that if you want a more nuanced explanation of my thought process behind these opinions, you can find it here. Before I get started, however, I am going to take a brief moment to note that I don't think I've ever, and I've been playing Magic for almost 20 years at this point, I don't think I've legitimately ever seen any piece of Magic news that has riled up the Magic community as found on social media as much as the Rules Committee's announcement last Monday. And I have to be honest, while I understand the shock and the surprise, the sheer density of vitriol that has been leveled at the Rules Committee, at the Commander Advisory Group, even at content creators who are just in the space, is unreasonable. If you are so upset over a decision like this, and you feel that the appropriate response is to go to your nearest internet and send death threats to the people that you feel are responsible, just quit. Social media, Magic as a whole, even just get away from your computer. Just quit. Seriously. We don't need that. Okay, I've said my piece on that. As far as the announcement itself, if you've been living under a rock in the Magic community for the last week, 4 cards were recently banned by the Commander Rules Committee, who are a group of 5 individuals who are not affiliated with Wizards of the Coast in, I won't say in any way, but they're not employed by them. They do communicate with them and work with them as far as discussing matters like this, but Commander's kind of weird in the fact that they're allowed to exist and operate pretty independently, and this decision was made by them after much consideration, and not by Wizards of the Coast. Now, Wizards isn't blameless, we'll touch on that in a little bit, but 4 cards were banned. Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, Dockside Extortionist, and Nadu Winged Wisdom. The last 2, so Dockside Extortionist and Nadu, generally have been reasonably received bans. I haven't had the misfortune of playing with or against Nadu, so I'm going to take everyone's word on it that the play patterns are miserable. They certainly sound miserable, and I've been around the game enough to understand how a combo deck like Nadu is supposed to work. I'm not going to waste too much time on that because everybody saw that ban coming, and nobody's really all that sad to see it go, except perhaps some people in the CEDH community. And we're going to put a second pin in that and come back to that in a moment. The main sources of consternation were involving the Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt bans. And there are several different areas of consternation involving them. Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt were both cards that were approaching or exceeding $100. Mana Crypt was actually pushing toward $200. And Jeweled Lotus, in addition to that, can only really be played in Commander, whereas Mana Crypt at least has a home in Vintage still. Although, in all honesty, with the size of the Vintage community, for most intents and purposes, the ban in Commander removes 90+% of the playability of these two cards, and their values tanked immediately. Basically, you can pick them up for half or less than half of what they cost a week ago. And there are a number of people who are complaining about the loss of value to their collection, and for what it's worth, I 100% understand that. Both cards have been legal in the format for multiple years. Mana Crypt has actually been legal in the format since its inception. And honestly, with them both being chase cards in sets within the last 12 to 15 months. I mean, you had Jeweled Lotus was in Commander Masters, and Mana Crypt was in Lost Caverns of Ixalan as a special art treatment, and literally just rotated out of being available readily, and I use the term readily, loosely, in Mystery Booster 1. Because Mystery Booster 2 is out, it's going to be the new convention booster pack moving forward, so there aren't going to be any more copies of Crypt entering the card pool from that standpoint. And the timing on the ban admittedly looks fishy as a tuna boat. I get it. But Wizards did not make this call and have been likely burned pretty solidly as far as opportunities to take advantage of the reprint equity of these expensive cards, which inherently could be argued as its own problem. Effectively, you have Jeweled Lotus, which was a difficult mythic to acquire even out of its original set, and while Commander Masters provided a very welcome reprint that dropped the price for a little while, it's already crept back up very quickly. It's basically back where it was, maybe even a little more expensive before it got banned. And I would argue that part of the issue here, as many people have correctly, in my opinion, pointed out, is that these cards are this expensive because not enough copies have been getting out into the card pool. Wizards has been really too stingy with their reprint equity, and when they do let it loose, it goes into products that sell for $10, $15, $20 a booster pack. And that's not a good way to get cards in the hands of players. It's a great way to make Hasbro money, and from that standpoint, they're doing a great job. They are running a successful company. But as a player, I can definitely understand the frustration because you're not able to get the cards you want. I don't mind cards even being expensive, but by the same token, how much is too much? Like, part of what made my time playing Yu-Gi-Oh! So frustrating was that you had chase cards like Tour Guide from the Underworld when it first came out that were $200, $300 a crack, and if you wanted to be playing a top-tier strategy, you needed 3. And Tour Guide was hardly the only example of this. I mean, Dark Armed Dragon was one, and I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but part of the reason I liked Magic when I got into it was, yes, there are expensive cards, but by and large, they aren't $100 and $200, and you can find a format to play in where you don't need them in casual circles. And Commander has kind of gotten to the point where it is the format for casuals, which is awesome. I can always find a Commander game when I hit a local game store or a convention, and that's great. But it has been monetized to the point where you have lots of cards that are 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 or more dollars, and cards like Jeweled Lotus and Dockside Extortionist were not only designed for Commander, they were so powerful that they detracted from the overall health of the format. I know that nobody was abundantly happy to see Jeweled Lotus previewed or printed. Card was a design mistake, and that was clear from day one. It was a card that was printed to sell packs, and it was done so with a blatant disregard for format health. No 2 cents about that. Dockside's origins were a little more innocuous, but it did not take people abundantly long to figure out that it was literally the best red accelerant printed for Commander ever. Full stop. Dockside had at least been talked about in previous announcements, so nobody was really surprised to see it go, and many of us welcome it. Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt kind of came out of nowhere. Like I said, I've been playing Magic for 20 years and Commander for 15. And the Rules Committee's approach in the last 15 years, which I have disagreed with at various points in my history, has been very laissez-faire. They're very hands-off. They let the format kind of self-regulate. And the general philosophy has been that everything is fine as long as you pretend that the most busted, hurtful cards don't exist. And by and large, somehow this worked. Now, there are cards that I do wish would be excised from the format. I'm sure every Commander player has at least a handful. Though at this point, really the only one I would really like to see go is Psych Rift. But realistically, I can understand the arguments for others that have been presented, like Rhystic Study. That said, while Jeweled Lotus was a net negative for the format, and its removal is a net positive for the format play experience, and arguably the same could be said for Mana Crypt, neither card was at a point where it was proving to be especially problematic in the format. And I will say that anecdotally because I typically play in non-CEDH circles where you're typically playing at a table that has an optimized strategy that is well considered and tuned. So I know the joke is that my deck is a 7. I'm used to playing in playgroups where decks are somewhere in the range of 6 to 8. You have some that don't pan out as well. You have some that are very strong, but they aren't CEDH for multiple reasons. And while I would say that my experience is generally limited to local environments, I've been to enough external Magic events around the country at this point that I like to think I have some reasonable perspective on the health of the format and whether something is truly a problem. Dockside blows out games. Lots of times when I play a Dockside, it will enable all kinds of shenanigans. And I do have a Blink deck that I've abused it in, even in treasure decks or just as a mana accelerant that you can, if it dies, darn, I'll bring it back with Sun Titan. The value was too much. I've never actually played a Jeweled Lotus. I have a giant card art of the Elena Richards art. I have a Jiggly print from Elena Danner, both hanging up on my walls, but I don't have the actual card itself. But I also almost never saw the card, and it's been out for 4 years. Granted, 2 of them were during the pandemic, but I just don't see it. And I do see Mana Crypt a fair bit, but by and large, It's a second Soul Ring. Granted, it's better than Soul Ring because it costs 0 and its drawback is meaningless in most games, though I've died to my own mana crypt a time or 6. It happens, and it's generally the highlight of the evening when it does. Neither were problems in the format, and neither were telegraphed, nor was the concept that the Rules Committee was even contemplating the review of fast mana. None of this was discussed. Not with the community at large during these quarterly announcements. Not with the Commander Advisory Group. And while I understand the logic that was presented in the follow-up FAQ from the Rules Committee, suggesting that they did not want anybody outside of themselves knowing the decision so that it could not be abused for financial gain. Well, I get that for the community at large, because there are lots of people who would try. Why in God's name do you have a Commander Advisory Group if you aren't going to provide them this information? Now, it has come out at this point that they relented slightly, and instead of letting them find out with the rest of us on Monday, a message was posted in their Discord on the Saturday before, so they had roughly 2 days advance notice, give or take 12 hours. Did you just not trust your advisory group to, advise you when you were making a decision of this magnitude, Rules Committee? Did you really feel that this group of people who were appointed by your body to assist you in gathering data and keeping a pulse on the committee, or not the committee, the community, did you really not trust them to have a civilized conversation in any capacity with you about this? And while I do say Rules Committee when I'm addressing the 5 individuals on that committee, I am certain, though I don't know in what percentages, some members of that committee are more responsible for this push than others. The only person whose stance and vote have been made public at this point was Olivia, and God bless her, she has put up with some trash in the last week. And I don't have words for how she must feel. It's awful to see that. And not just her. There has been nonsense like this thrown at every member of the Rules Committee, to be clear. And it's terrible on all counts. But hers has been the most publicized and honestly probably the lion's share, though by percentages that may not be by a terribly large margin. And that's just unacceptable. Olivia is someone who I've gotten to meet, admittedly in passing, at Command Fests, and she's awesome. I actually got to see her at the Game Nights Live in Indianapolis at Gen Con this year as well, and she just seems like a delightful person and a fun Commander player to sit down at the table with. And what we as a community have done, and again, I know that the vast majority of us out there do not do this, but the vocal minority has been very vocal. We have done the Rules Committee a disservice with this level of vitriol, and it needs to stop. You can be upset. You can have opinions. You should be both with this decision, to be perfectly honest. But you need to be civilized about this feedback. I think by this point, they've gotten the message loud and clear that they screwed up. Their communication was unacceptable on pretty much every level, and had that portion alone been handled better, and in my opinion, I agree with the stance that if the bans had been staggered, the response would have been better received. But in addition to staggering those bans, the conversation of, hey, we're looking at fast mana, should have come up in some capacity. You don't even have to name specific cards, which, honestly, the argument that by naming specific cards on a watch list, you're putting the less, enfranchised players who aren't, on social media, who don't know who the Commander Rules Committee is, at greater risk of losing money. I don't agree with that. It's just frankly not true. All you've done by doing this is make sure that everybody loses. And that's not better. In an ideal world, nobody should lose, but all you've done at this point is ensure that everybody loses. And in all honesty, the idea that telling us that you're looking at specific cards is going to hurt players who are less knowledgeable about the game isn't necessarily true, because looking at a card does not mean that you're going to ban it. So, for all you know, you're looking at a card like, let's say, Lotus Petal, and it goes on a watch list, and people trade their Lotus Petals to the less experienced players at their LGSs, and then you decide, after getting some data points and watching for about 3 to 6 months, that Lotus Petal's fine. We're not going to ban it. It is very powerful. It's on the top end of what we want in the format, but we've decided that while we're going to watch it, it's fine. We're removing it from the watch list. Suddenly, the players who got the Lotus Petals are the ones better off on that trade. And the experienced players who tried to game the system got a life lesson out of it. So if you're treating the watch list as a precursor to a ban, exclusively, and not treating it as an actual watch list where you're actually taking data points and evaluating it, you're doing it wrong. And I would ask that you not. Now, I mentioned a pin about CEDH in here, and there's been a lot of consternation about whether CEDH should be its own format. I've been on record in our blog multiple times at this point, and pretty much anytime anyone has asked me about CEDH in the last 4 years, CEDH has always been distinctly different from EDH, despite using the same format rules and restrictions. The deck building for CEDH is very different from how you would build a traditional commander deck in lots of regards. Fast mana is a necessity at all costs. You generally play far fewer land, and the strategies are always geared toward winning the fastest way possible, rather than exploring the options and building for a more social game. That doesn't mean you can't have a social game with CEDH, because there is infinitely more interaction, but generally with more casual tables, up to power level 7 or 8, you can build optimized, but you're not building specifically to bend every table over your knee by turn 3. CEDH always plays to win at above all costs, and always wants to find the most efficient way to do and protect that condition at all costs. And because of that, the deck building constraints are very different. And that's been the case since its inception. Anybody who truly believes it's the same format as EDH does not have enough of a foot in both pools. And I'm not a big CEDH player, but I watch some content periodically, and there are a few channels I watch fairly religiously just to make sure I'm educated. And at the end of the day, I don't have a good answer on whether CEDH should split off, because there are good arguments for both cases. On the one hand, like I said, you build it differently, it attracts different people, and there are just certain things you have to do to build a viable deck in that wing of the format. On the flip side of that, there have been a number of attempts to already do this from a community grassroots standpoint, and they've been run by some questionable individuals, or just haven't gotten the supporter off the ground because of one reason or another. And ultimately, CEDH continues to do well because it's still under the base commander umbrella. You still have players who are getting pulled from that pool of casuals who go, oh, okay, what would it be like if I tried a deck that was like this? And then some people find that that is their preferred style of play, and they prioritize CEDH. Some find that, nah, it's too cutthroat for me. I'd rather, get some beer and pretzels and hang out with my friends and do cool stuff and be battle cruisery, but still be somewhat focused and optimized so that, we can have a good game, but it doesn't have to be, one that's going to necessarily end in 10 minutes. Now, a lot of CEDH games do not end in 10 minutes. Many of them are actually as or more involved than a casual Commander game. Just, again, the sheer amount of interaction, counterspells, checks and balances going around. There's a lot of intricacy and timing in CEDH that can really draw a game out beyond what you might expect. But Commander games in the more casual circles are often longer just because they're not as optimized. So if you're looking for a more social experience, a more casual Commander game is generally going to be the better solution. Now, if I had to make a call as to whether it would be better or worse for CEDH to split off, because CEDH does benefit from being under the Commander umbrella, and like it or not, the Rules Committee is made up of seasoned, highly knowledgeable Magic players who volunteer their time and knowledge to make sure that the format is A, healthy, and B, is not directly run by wizards. Which, again, there aren't very many formats like that out in the wild for Magic. And I think that that's a good thing in this case. Nobody's perfect. The Rules Committee has clearly misstepped here in terms of how they handled this. And I would personally argue that the Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt bans were an error. Commander, to me, is Vintage Light. You get all the fun of playing Vintage without having to worry about buying a set of power. I've gotten the privilege of playing some of the most busted Magic cards printed in paper in Commander. I used to own them. I've played Mishra's Workshop. I've played Bazaar of Baghdad. I've played Time Twister. It's fun. The cards are fun. I enjoyed playing them. I don't want to see that joy taken away from other players as these powerhouses are deemed too powerful for the format by a body that has decided that they want to take a change in tact for how they're going to manage the format. I've kind of gotten attached to the laissez-faire approach at this point. And if it means cards like Psychrift that I don't especially like are still legal in the format, so be it. Everybody's got cards in the format that they don't like. They're not causing the same problems as Dockside Extortionist in the case of Lotus Crypt or even Psychrift. They're just really powerful cards that do really powerful things and enable strategies sooner than perhaps they should. And in the case of Psychrift, it will actually break a board state and end a game, even if it does so in the most unfair way possible. I get it. It's fun to play with the busted cards. Let us play with the busted cards. Outside of this, there are a couple other angles that I want to touch on very quickly. First, I feel for the artists here who have done art for Jeweled Lotus. I've been to several of the conventions Elena Danner is at, and Jeweled Lotus is a huge part of her branding. It is her most signature recognizable piece, and it's not close. To not have a format where you can play that card sucks. And I've been past and to Alina Richards' booth too. It's the same sort of thing, where this is a very recognizable piece. It's much newer, so it isn't quite the signature status in many cases, but if you're familiar with her work, you know the piece. Does that mean I think that artist considerations should be taken into account when deciding whether to ban a card? No. And I don't think that's the problem that either of the artists brought up when they found out about the ban announcement. The problem here is that Jeweled Lotus is a card that you could only play in Commander. And while you could easily make the argument, and I agree with the idea that Wizards should not have designed Jeweled Lotus as they did, you can also feel for the artists who have to consider their businesses in this scenario too. So if you're trying to blow them off as part of this whole discussion where you're like, oh, but you can't decide whether a card should stay in a format because of its art. No, you really can't. But you can have some empathy for their situation and the fact that this is going to likely do at least a little damage to their businesses. I don't think that's terribly much to ask. Beyond that, I don't really have a lot else to say on the subject, and I was torn on this announcement from the jump. I remain torn on it. I feel for the people who have been taking flack for it because the community response has been reprehensible. Again, I will reiterate, if you are someone who feels that you need to be a keyboard warrior and send out death threats because you don't like something someone said on the internet or did in your game, just quit. We don't need that. You don't need that. It's not good for anybody involved to put that kind of garbage out into the world, especially when I know that pretty much every person leveling a death threat wouldn't have the guts to say those same things to someone's face. It's cowardly, it's disgusting, and it has no place in our format or our game. Thanks for watching. I hope this clarifies my thoughts on a number of things. And if you have any other questions or thoughts of your own, please feel free to put them in the comments. As long as you're making a point in good faith and not trying to start trouble, I'm all for hearing your thoughts. There are so many different angles to analyze here, and the fallout from this announcement is going to be felt for a very long time. I only hope that the right lessons are learned. I hope that the people who have been unjustly abused continue to work with the format. I don't know who I would elect in place of any of the Rules Committee members, to be perfectly honest. But none of them deserved the flack that they were getting. None of them deserved the personal attacks. And all of them have put a lot of time and effort into making the game a little better each day. Thank you for watching.
If you like what you just saw, please support us by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more great gaming content.